In this section, we will be looking at animal nutrition. And we can ask ourselves the question, do we live to eat or do we eat to live? So we're going to explore the importance of food as well. But then where does this food actually come from? In our previous studies, we could realize that, or we understood that all organisms except plants and some bacterial strains get food source from a source that is already made. So the plants and some bacteria are able to manufacture their own food through the process of photosynthesis for some plants and bacteria, or chemosynthesis for some species of bacteria. And hence, since they are able to manufacture their own food, we call them producers, because they are the ones who will produce food for the remaining other organisms in any food chain or food web. The first then other organisms that are able to feed directly on these plants, I'll talk about just the food chains established by plants as producers. The first organisms in line after the plants that feed on plants are called herbivores, because they eat only plant material. Hence, we call them primary consumers. The second organisms in line after the herbivores would be the secondary consumers, who would be probably carnivores. And the third organisms would be the tertiary consumers, who will be either carnivores or herbivores, either carnivores or omnivores, meaning they are now able to eat directly from plant material or from even animal material. Omnivores, for example, us humans or pigs, we are omnivores. So then why is food important? Food is important because it is this food that provides our bodies with components, organic molecules such as carbohydrates, proteins, or fats that are then used to build cellular structures like cell membranes or cytoplasmic inclusions, which also help to build tissues, because if we're making many cellular structures, we're making many cells consequently, and consequently we're also making tissues, and we can go on. All of these lead to growth, and that's why the size we have today is not necessarily the size we were born with. We've been growing. And food also provides us with energy, and additionally it provides us with regulatory substances such as vitamins, mineral salts, and water that assist in helping us undergo certain functions in the body, or certain bodily functions that are necessary to keep us healthy. So that is the importance of food. We will now look at the different processes that take place when we take in food. What happens step by step. Okay. There are many adaptations displayed by herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores according to their specific diets, the kind of food sources that they majorly feed on. These adaptations are reflected by their different dental formulae or modes of dentition, and also reflected by their differences in stomach and intestines, where we won't investigate the stomach and intestines, how they look different. But here we're looking at the teeth, how different they are. If we look, for example, at I'll start here with the herbivore. My example will be a horse, for example. When we look at the incisor, the front teeth, we'll see that it is flattened and broad and is chisel-like, very sharp, such that when they are grazing, cutting grass, they can have a clean cut because it's very sharp, and then they send it at the back, the mouth. But with the incisors of the carnivores, for example, the dog, it's not that broad and flattened, it's pointy and small in size, kind of sharp. And that of omnivores like humans is more or less halfway between that of herbivores and carnivores. Now next, if we observe still with the herbivore, I'll go first with the carnivore, we will see that the carnivore has canines that are curved, long, and pointy. With omnivores, they also have canines that are curved, but not as long and pointy and sharp as that of carnivores. While with herbivores, some of them have canines, but not as developed as that of the previous two. But some other herbivores like rabbits don't have canines at all. But at least all herbivores have this space here, the space which will occur between the incisor and the premolars and molars. And that space is what we call the diastamen. The diastamen is there to allow free rolling of the tongue while they are grasping grass to cut, like with the chisel, or when they are rolling grass in their mouth. It allows that free rolling of the tongue to roll and mix food once it has been eaten. Again, when we look at the premolars and molars of the herbivores, they are very broad and flattened with a flat top to allow easy grinding of food when they're chewing. But with the premolars of carnivores, we'll see that it's kind of jagged. It's rough and jagged and kind of like a blade or sword to still again bite and cut off pieces of flesh and grab their prey. The premolars and molars of omnivores is more or less halfway between that of herbivores and carnivores, not too flattened and not too jagged. So that's the differences that we see with the dentition of these three classic groups of organisms based on their specific diets. Now the alimentary canal. Specifically here we are looking at the alimentary canal of humans. The alimentary canal of humans. First, it starts with the mouth. The nasal passage there is not part of it. That we'll be looking at it when we are doing gaseous exchange. Our alimentary canal starts with the mouth, where we have ingestion. If you remember, the taking in of food. You have ingestion that occurs through the mouth. The mouth is closed in the front by two lips in humans and on the sides by the muscles of the jaw, such that it forms a kind of opening, a space that we call the mouth cavity or the buccal cavity. Inside the mouth, we find the tongue. We'll talk about what happens with the tongue when we are going specifically into the processes of ingestion, digestion, and etc. At the back of the mouth, we have the pharynx. The pharynx is the space that separates halfway between the alimentary canal and the air canal that's used for breathing. So when food is swallowed, it goes through or it goes to the pharynx. At the level of the pharynx, we have a small opening somewhere here which connects the alimentary canal and the air canal. That's the reason why you are able to breathe with your mouth if you close your nose. You are able to take in air through your mouth and it will pass through that small opening and go into your trachea. But then this same opening also, if you are eating and it's kept open, the glottis, if the glottis is kept open, then and you're speaking while you're eating, that's why we usually experience choking, because food particles might leave from the alimentary canal and go inside, pass through the epiglottis, pass through the glottis and go inside the respiratory tract, causing choking. So to avoid that, there is another small structure here, small structure that I have here. We call it the epiglottis. When you are swallowing food, the epiglottis closes the glottis. So it closes the glottis so that food does not move into the respiratory tract, hence avoiding choking. Now, after the pharynx, we have a tube that we call the esophagus, a muscular tube. The esophagus receives food from the pharynx and directs it to the stomach. The esophagus is made up of rings of muscles, circular and radial muscles, that contract and relax in a process, in a rhythmical way, in a process we call peristalsis, to push the bolus of food towards the stomach, to push the ball of food, we call it the bolus, towards the stomach. So it is the esophagus that allows food to go towards the stomach, and this occurs involuntarily. It means you are not in control of it. The moment you squeeze your tongue upward to push the ball of food backwards towards the pharynx so that you can swallow, the rest of the swallowing is done automatically by the esophagus muscles. And while it's squeezing food, it's churning the food. We'll look at that when we get further. Now, the stomach is like a sack, a bag that lies in the abdominal cavity, just above the diaphragm. When we'll be looking at gaseous exchange, we'll talk about the diaphragm. The stomach lies just above the diaphragm. The stomach receives food coming from the esophagus, and between the stomach and the esophagus, we have that little opening there, which is closed by a certain valve when food is not being transported from esophagus to the stomach. That valve is made up of a ring of muscles that will close this part here. We call them sphincter muscles. In specifically at this point, we are looking at the cardiac sphincter muscle. The same kind of set of ring of muscles occurs also at the other exit point of the stomach when we are going to the small intestine. We call that muscle there the pyloric sphincter muscle. So we have two sphincter muscles here. We have the cardiac because it's closer to the heart, and we have the pyloric sphincter muscle because it's closer to the small intestine. Now, the stomach has a wall made up of muscles which are also able to contract and relax and hence squeeze and churn food to make it even softer. From the stomach, we'll go now through the small intestine. The small intestine is made up of three parts. The first part, which appears like a curve, is what we call the duodenum. And the duodenum gives then way to another small part which we call the jejunum. And the jejunum now extends into the longest part of the small intestine that we call the ileum. The small intestine from the duodenum to the ileum is about 2.5 to 4.5 meters long in adults. The duodenum, the ileum now makes contact with a small short section that we call the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine, because the large intestine as well is divided into three parts. It's called the cecum, and the large intestine, the second part of it is called the colon. The colon, which is the longest part of the large intestine. And the large intestine ends up with a short part here, which we call the rectum, which opens up to the exterior through what we call the anus, an opening found at the exterior at the end of the digestive tube. So this is a big part of the digestive system. We'll look at other features such as the pancreas that we have here at the curve of the duodenum, that is the pancreas. The pancreas has dual functions. It provides pancreatic juice to help in digestion, pancreatic juice which is delivered in the small intestine, and it also produces hormones, glucagon and insulin that help to convert glucose to glycogen or glycogen back to glucose. The pancreas, together with the bile is stored in a small sac here found in the liver that we call the gallbladder. If you've ever taken out chicken liver when it's still just taken out and not yet managed, you'll see a small bag on that liver that looks green. Usually if it gets burst and touches your meat gets bitter. That bag is what we call the gallbladder, and the green liquid that is inside is what we call bile. So the bile has a small duct, a kind of short tube here that comes and meets with another short tube also that comes from the pancreas. They meet somewhere here. So we have a bile duct and we have a pancreatic duct that meets up at an entry point of the small intestine, the duodenum. Since these two ducts meet, we have the bile and the pancreatic duct. They then form at that entry point a double duct area that we call the hepatopancreatic duct that delivers substances inside the duodenum that will assist in digestion. So that's about the gallbladder. And the liver is there to break down harmful substances and the conversion of excess sugars into carbohydrates. So this summarizes the human alimentary canal. Now, if we look at the small intestine in detail and we have a cross section of it, this is what it will look like. That will be the cross section of the small intestine. It means they've cut that tube like I cut a pipe and I turn it around so that it's looking at you, facing you cross-sectionally. We'll then notice that the small intestine has 4 different layers. An outer layer, which we call the serosa, that will be our outer layer, which we call the serosa, which is made up of epithelial cells, and a middle layer, or after the serosa, we have a muscular layer, a layer made up of muscles, that's what we call the muscularis, which is made up of 2 types of muscles, or 2 layers of muscles. An outer longitudinal muscles that are made up of radial muscles, and an inner layer of circular muscles. Then after the muscularis, we have the submucosa. The submucosa is more or less like the most living part of the small intestine because it contains blood vessels, it contains nerve endings, it contains lymph vessels. That's what we find inside the submucosa. And the inner layer will be the mucosa. The mucosa is made up of connective tissue and lined up with columnar epithelium and goblet cells that secrete mucus. The mucosa also has in it small finger-like projections, millions of them. You can see here they look like fingers, finger-like projections inside the mucosa or on the inner part of the mucosa. These small finger-like projections, we call them villi for plural. Otherwise, one is called villus. Now, this is the diagram of one villus that we have from the mucosa. One villus. If you look at the villus, it is covered by a single layer, just one layer thick. These are 1 cells here that we see. The villus is covered by a single layer of epithelial cells. And when we look at these epithelial cells, we will identify two types of cells there. We have the columnar epithelial cells that form that outer boundary. With infiltrated in between the columnar epithelial cells, we have goblet cells. These are goblet cells. You'll see goblet cells, they have an opening. They're facing outside like an open, like a cup. These are goblet cells, and these goblet cells are involved in producing mucus that helps to lubricate. Now, the central core of the villus is made up of connective tissue. These are tissues that join body parts to one another, like they help them to stick, to glue to one another. Within that central core, there is a single lymph vessel, just one lymph vessel that occurs within that central core there. A single lymph vessel here that we call the lacteal. The lacteal, call it the lacteal here. And the lacteal is mainly involved in absorbing fat and transporting fat. It will join with the lymph vessel to transport substances around the body. So that will be the lacteal. Again, the lacteal, if we see here, it's surrounded by a network of capillaries. You will see here, these little circles here, these are blood capillaries. They are the smallest versions of blood vessels. So if you get a vein will become smaller to form venules, and venules even become even more smaller to form capillaries, such that they can go to any part of the body. So those are capillaries. The capillaries will then join up. We'll see the capillaries joining. Will then join up to form again a venule. So this time we are leaving from small to big. Earlier when I said veins becomes venule, then capillaries, we are leaving from vein big, venule medium, capillary small. So here we are leaving from capillary to venule, from smallest to medium. And the venule will then transport everything that is absorbed in the small intestine to the body. That includes nutrients in the form of glucose, in the form of amino acids, in the form of fatty acids. We'll see that as we move on. So they rejoin to leave to form the venule, which will then leave the villus and go to the rest of the body. Again, Just clear up a little bit here. Again, we have crypts of Lieberkühn, which occur between the villi. And when we look at the villi that are found inside the duodenum, we will also identify glands of Brummer or Brunner's glands. Both the crypts of Lieberkühn and Brunner's gland are involved in producing an alkaline mucus. Two aspects there. We have alkaline and we have mucus. The mucus will then be helpful in lubricating, making slippery the internal parts of the small intestine. While the alkaline is opposite of acid. The alkaline in the small intestine will be there to protect the small intestine against the acid from the acid food that comes from the stomach. When the stomach releases food, the acid chime into the small intestine. So the alkaline in the small intestine will help protect the small intestine against corrosion, damage from the acid. Now, I already talked about the muscular layer of the small intestine. It is also there to help contract, causing the walls of the small intestine to contract and relax in a rhythmical manner, just like we saw with the esophagus, in a rhythmical manner that we refer to as peristalsis, to help move the food down the small intestine and to the large intestine, where peristalsis will still continue at the time of egestion. Then food will be let out through the anus. One point to notice is that all parts of the small intestine have the same or similar basic structure. Talking about all parts, we're looking at the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The same basic structure made up of serosa, muscularis, submucosa, and mucosa. The inner part of the intestine where substances flow is what we call the lumen. Okay, so that's the structure, the detailed structure of the small intestine.